In the official Soviet story, Joseph Stalin rises to power almost like a law of nature, the faithful disciple of Lenin, the steel-hard organizer, the man who simply happens to be standing at the center when the revolution consolidates. In the anti-Soviet story, he is a schemer who tricks everyone, a provincial thug who hijacks a movement built by greater minds. The documented record is more unsettling than either myth. Stalin's ascent was not an accident, not a single coup, and not a purely personal drama. It was the product of a revolution that militarized politics, a civil war that normalized emergency rule, a party that fused ideology with discipline, and an institutional architecture that rewarded the man who could control appointments, information, and coercion. Stalin understood those levers earlier and used them more ruthlessly than almost anyone around him. He did not rise by one spectacular move. He rose by turning the machinery of the Bolshevik state into a ladder, rung by rung, until there was no higher authority left to check him. He begins far from the marble halls of Petrograd. Iosif Vissarionovich Dzhugashvili is born on 18 December 1878 Old Style, 6 December in Gori, in the Tiflis Governorate of the Russian Empire, in what is now Georgia. The empire's southern borderlands are a pressure cooker of national grievances, imperial policing, and radical underground networks. Stalin's early life is documented in fragments, but the outline is clear. A scholarship student at the Tiflis Theological Seminary, he drifts into Marxist circles and is expelled in 1899. This matters not because it foreshadows some cinematic villain origin, but because it places him in a specific type of revolutionary formation, conspiratorial, disciplined, and accustomed to secrecy. The revolutionary underground in the Caucasus is not a debating society. It is a world of safe houses, forged documents, and police informants. It is also a world where money is a constant problem and where the line between political fundraising and criminality blurs. By the early 1900s, Stalin is a professional revolutionary, arrested and exiled multiple times. The Tsarist police, the Okhrana, are aggressive, exile to Siberia is common, escape is common too. Stalin's repeated arrests and returns are not unique among Bolsheviks, but they build a skill set, endurance, operational security, and a hard pragmatism about power. In the factional split of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party in 1903, Stalin aligns with Lenin's Bolsheviks, the faction that insists on a tightly organized party of professional revolutionaries rather than a broad, looser movement. That choice is not just ideological. It is a bet on an organizational model that will later become the spine of the Soviet state. One of the most notorious episodes of Stalin's pre-1917 career is tied to the Bolsheviks' desperate need for funds. On 13 June 1907, in Tiflis, a major armed robbery hits a state bank money transfer in what is often called the Tiflis bank robbery. The operation involves bombs and gunfire in the city center and results in dozens of casualties. Bolshevik expropriations like this are not a footnote. They reveal the moral and tactical environment of early Bolshevism and Stalin's willingness to operate in it. The degree of his direct operational control has been debated by historians, but his association with the Caucasus Bolshevik network that carried out such actions is well established. What matters for his later rise is the reputation it builds inside a revolutionary culture that prizes effectiveness and loyalty over respectability. Stalin's relationship with Lenin is not intimate in the early years, but it is consequential. Lenin values organizers who can build party structures in hostile conditions. Stalin is not the party's most brilliant theorist or most famous orator. He is something Lenin needs, a reliable cadre man. In 1912, Lenin co-opts Stalin into the Bolshevik Central Committee at the Prague Conference, a key moment in the Bolsheviks' move toward a more independent organization. That same year, Stalin publishes Marxism and the National Question, a pamphlet written under Lenin's guidance, addressing the empire's nationalities problem. It is not a literary masterpiece, but it signals Stalin's utility on a critical issue, how a revolutionary party in a multi-ethnic empire handles nationalism. In the coming years, that question will become state policy, border-making, and war. Then comes 1917, the year that breaks the empire. The February Revolution topples Nicholas II and creates a provisional government, while Soviets workers and soldiers councils compete for legitimacy. Lenin returns in April with the April Theses, calling for all power to the Soviets, and the Bolsheviks pivot from supporting a bourgeois revolution to pushing for a second, socialist one. Stalin, returning from exile in March 1917, is part of the Bolshevik leadership in Petrograd during the chaotic months before Lenin's arrival. He is not the face of the revolution, he is not the man on the armored car, but he is present in the apparatus, in the editorial offices, in the committee rooms where decisions are translated into orders. The October Revolution, 7 November 1917, in the Gregorian calendar brings the Bolsheviks to power in Petrograd. It is not a mass democratic mandate. It is a seizure of key points backed by armed workers and sympathetic soldiers, followed by political consolidation. The new regime immediately faces civil war, foreign intervention, economic collapse, and internal rebellion. In this environment, the Bolsheviks build institutions designed for survival. The Cheka, created in December 1917 under Felix Dzerzhinsky, the Red Army, organized by Leon Trotsky, and a centralized party state that treats opposition as existential threat. The logic of emergency becomes permanent. This is the crucible where Stalin's later methods become normal state practice. During the Civil War, Stalin is sent to critical fronts as a political commissar and representative of the central leadership. In 1918, he is dispatched to Tsaritsyn on the Volga, a strategic city later renamed Stalingrad. The documented record from Tsaritsyn reveals a pattern. Stalin intervenes in military affairs, clashes with professional specialists and with Trotsky's central command, and supports harsh measures against perceived enemies. The Bolsheviks rely on former Tsarist specialists to run the army under political supervision. Trotsky defends this as necessary. Stalin distrusts them and backs local commanders who share his suspicion. The conflict is not merely personal, it reflects a deeper tension in the new regime, whether expertise can be separated from class origin and who controls coercive power. Stalin's stance aligns with a hardline political instinct: loyalty over competence, control over flexibility. Civil war also teaches Stalin something about the party's internal culture. Survival rewards those who can claim to be the most vigilant against enemies. The Red Terror, the suppression of uprisings, the use of hostages, the creation of camps, these are not inventions of the 1930s. They are born in the years when the state is fighting for its life, and when the Bolsheviks convince themselves that extraordinary violence is not only permissible but historically necessary. When later purges come, they will be justified with the same vocabulary of vigilance and sabotage, now applied not only to former elites, but to the party itself. By 1921, the civil war is winding down, and the Bolsheviks confront a different crisis. The economy is shattered, cities are starving, and peasant revolts flare. The Kronstadt Rebellion in March 1921 is a shock. Sailors once celebrated as revolution's vanguard rise against Bolshevik rule, demanding Soviets without Bolsheviks. Trotsky and the government crushed the rebellion with force. The same year, Lenin introduces the new economic policy, NEP, retreating from war communism to allow limited market mechanisms and private trade. At the 10th Party Congress in March 1921, the party adopts the ban on factions, a decision meant to prevent internal splits in a fragile state. This is one of the most important institutional steps on Stalin's road to power. The ban is justified as temporary emergency discipline. In practice, it becomes a weapon. Organized opposition inside the party can now be labeled illegitimate by definition. Stalin's formal position in these years is also crucial. He becomes People's Commissar for Nationalities in 1917, a role that places him at the intersection of ideology and administration across the non-Russian periphery. The Soviet state is trying to hold together territories with strong national movements: Ukraine, the Caucasus, Central Asia, while claiming to support self-determination. The result is a complicated system of union republics and autonomous regions, and constant disputes over central control. Stalin's approach is consistently centralizing. His handling of the Georgian question in 1922, where he and his allies pressure Georgian communists into accepting Moscow's terms for integration into a Transcaucasian federation, becomes a flashpoint. Lenin, increasingly ill, is disturbed by reports of heavy-handedness. This conflict will echo into Lenin's final political struggle and into the moral legitimacy of Stalin's succession. The turning point in Stalin's ascent is often dated to 3 April 1922, when he is appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party. At the time, it does not look like the supreme office of a future dictator. It is an administrative post created to manage the growing party apparatus. But in a system where the party is the state, administration is power. The General Secretary oversees the Secretariat, which handles the assignment and promotion of cadres. It controls who gets appointed to regional committees, who becomes a delegate to party congresses, who sits on key boards, who has access to information. This is not glamorous, but it is decisive. Stalin turns the Secretariat into a network of obligations and loyalties. Over time, the party becomes staffed by people whose careers depend on his favor, and who will vote accordingly when factional battles erupt. Lenin's health collapses in 1922 and 1923 after a series of strokes. The question of succession is not openly discussed, because Bolshevik ideology rejects the idea of personal rule, and because Lenin is still alive, a symbolic anchor. Yet power does not wait. A ruling group forms around the top leadership, and Stalin positions himself at its center. Alongside Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, Stalin forms what historians often call the Troika to counter Trotsky, the most famous revolutionary after Lenin and the architect of the Red Army. Trotsky is brilliant, but he is isolated, distrusted by many old Bolsheviks due to his late entry into the Bolshevik faction and his sharp, often contemptuous political style. Stalin is the opposite. He is not loved, but he is embedded in the apparatus and adept at coalition building. This is also when Lenin writes documents that later become politically radioactive. In late 1922 and early 1923, Lenin dictates a series of notes, including what is commonly called Lenin's Testament, in which he evaluates leading Bolsheviks and warns about the dangers of concentrated power. Lenin criticizes Stalin specifically, noting that Stalin has accumulated immense power as general secretary and questioning whether he will use it cautiously. Lenin also proposes Stalin's removal from the post. Another document, Lenin's letter to the Congress, and his notes on the national question reflect Lenin's alarm at bureaucratic arrogance and great Russian chauvinism. Lenin's final political move is an attempt to curb Stalin and the growing bureaucracy, but Lenin is incapacitated and the party leadership controls access to his words. After Lenin's death on 21 January 1924, the struggle becomes open, though still couched in ideological terms rather than personal ambition. The funeral itself becomes a political stage. Stalin positions himself as chief mourner and guardian of Lenin's legacy. Lenin's body is embalmed and placed in a mausoleum in Red Square, a decision that helps create a quasi-sacral revolutionary cult. Stalin's public image is shaped as Lenin's heir, not by virtue of charisma, but by association and ritual. The party's propaganda apparatus, increasingly centralized, reinforces this narrative. The testament is a pivotal moment. Lenin's critical notes about Stalin are read to select delegates at the 13th Party Congress in May 1924, but are not published widely. Zinoviev and Kamenev, who fear Trotsky more than they fear Stalin at this stage, help suppress Lenin's call to remove Stalin. This is not speculation. It is documented in party records and memoir literature. They believe they can manage Stalin, use him against Trotsky, and then sideline him later. It is one of the most consequential miscalculations in 20th century political history. By keeping Stalin in the general secretaryship, they preserve the very mechanism by which he will later destroy them. Stalin's ideological weapon in the mid-1920s is socialism in one country, a doctrine associated with him and Nikolai Bukharin, articulated in opposition to Trotsky's emphasis on permanent revolution and the dependence of Soviet socialism on international uprisings. The timing matters. By 1923-1924, revolutionary hopes in Germany and elsewhere have failed. The Soviet Union is isolated. Socialism in one country offers a psychologically and politically attractive line. The USSR can build socialism independently without waiting for the world revolution. It also justifies focusing on internal consolidation, which aligns perfectly with Stalin's control of the apparatus. Ideology and bureaucracy reinforce each other. The internal opposition to Stalin does not disappear. It is outmaneuvered and then criminalized. Trotsky is first. In 1925, Zinoviev and Kamenev break with Stalin after realizing he is not their junior partner. They form the new opposition, and then, in 1926, join with Trotsky in the united opposition. They criticize bureaucratization, argue for more internal party democracy, and warn about the dangers of Stalin's growing power. But the ban on factions from 1921 means their organized opposition is itself a violation of party discipline. Stalin uses the rules of the party, created in the name of unity, as a legalistic club. The opposition is condemned at party meetings. Their supporters are removed from posts. Their access to printing and platforms is restricted. The apparatus decides what the party hears and therefore what the party believes. At the same time, Stalin builds alliances with different wings of the leadership as needed. In the mid-1920s, he aligns with Bukharin, Alexei Rykov, and Mikhail Tomsky, figures associated with the NEP, and a more gradual economic approach against the left opposition. This is not ideological consistency, it is tactical sequencing. Stalin's method is to isolate one enemy at a time, using temporary coalitions that later become expendable. By 1927, Trotsky and Zinoviev are expelled from the party. Trotsky is exiled internally to Alma-Ata in 1928 and then deported from the USSR in 1929. The revolution's most famous commander is removed without a civil war, without a dramatic shootout, through institutional control and political discipline. That is the new kind of power Stalin has helped build. But Stalin's consolidation is not complete until he breaks the right wing too. The late 1920s bring a real economic crisis. Grain procurement collapses as peasants withhold grain rather than sell at low state prices. The Soviet state faces the nightmare of urban shortages and potential political instability. Here, Stalin makes the decision that defines the Soviet century: forced collectivization and rapid industrialization. In 1928, he travels to Siberia and the Urals and uses extraordinary measures to seize grain, a return to coercion reminiscent of war communism. This is not merely an economic policy shift. It is a political declaration that the state will use force to transform society. By 1929, Stalin turns against Bukharin and the NEP line. Bukharin warns against military feudal exploitation of the peasantry and argues for a slower path. Stalin frames this as right deviation, softness toward kulaks, and sabotage of socialist construction. Again, the pattern repeats. Ideological labels justify administrative purges. Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky are removed from key positions by 1930. Stalin now stands without serious rivals inside the top leadership. The party that once prided itself on collective leadership has been reshaped into a hierarchy where disagreement becomes treason. The first five-year plan begins in 1928, formally launched in 1929, aiming for explosive growth in heavy industry: steel, coal, machinery, electrification. The targets are often unrealistic, but the political logic is clear. The Soviet leadership fears war and encirclement. The memory of foreign intervention in the Civil War is fresh, and the rise of hostile powers in Europe will soon confirm those fears. Stalin argues that the USSR must industrialize rapidly or be crushed. In 1931, he famously declares that the USSR is 50 to 100 years behind advanced countries and must catch up in 10 years. The rhetoric is apocalyptic, and it is backed by coercion. Collectivization is the price. Beginning in 1929-1930, millions of peasant households are forced into collective farms. The state launches dekulakization, targeting so-called kulaks-richer peasants, but in practice often anyone who resists. Hundreds of thousands are arrested and deported to remote regions. Many die from hunger, exposure, or violence. The exact numbers remain debated, but the scale is immense, documented in Soviet archives and demographic studies. This is not an administrative adjustment, it is a social war in the countryside. Grain is extracted to feed cities and to export for industrial equipment. Resistance is met with force. The consequences are catastrophic. The famine of 1930–1933 hits Ukraine, the North Caucasus, the Volga region, and Kazakhstan with particular severity. In Ukraine, the Holodomor becomes a central historical trauma, with millions of deaths. In Kazakhstan, forced sedentarization and collectivization devastate nomadic life, leading to mass mortality and flight. The famine is not a natural disaster. It is the result of state policy, procurement quotas, repression, restrictions on movement, and the prioritization of industrial goals over rural survival. Stalin's power is now inseparable from mass suffering. The state is demonstrating that it can reorder life and death on a continental scale. Industrialization, meanwhile, transforms the USSR. New cities and projects rise: Magnitogorsk, the Dnieper hydroelectric station, massive steel plants, mines, railways. The workforce is disciplined through internal passports, labor laws, and political surveillance. The Gulag system expands, supplying forced labor for canals, mines, and construction. The White Sea-Baltic Canal, built largely by prisoners and completed in 1933, becomes a symbol of both Soviet ambition and human cost. This is not simply economic modernization. It is modernization through coercion, with the party state at the center. Stalin's authority becomes associated with building, with speed, with the capacity to mobilize resources, while the terror that enables it becomes normalized. By the mid-1930s, Stalin's power is vast, but it is not yet absolute in the psychological sense. The party still contains veterans of 1917 and the Civil War, people with independent revolutionary legitimacy. Stalin's next move is to destroy that legitimacy and replace it with fear and dependence. The trigger is complex, but a key event is the assassination of Sergei Kirov on 1 December 1934 in Leningrad. Kirov, a popular party leader, is shot by Leonid Nikolaev. The circumstances remain disputed, and historians continue to debate whether Stalin had prior knowledge or involvement. What is certain is how Stalin uses the assassination. Within hours, emergency decrees accelerate executions and reduce legal protections. The murder becomes the pretext for a sweeping campaign against enemies of the people. The Great Terror, or Great Purge, reaches its peak in 1937–1938, but its roots lie in the earlier consolidation of the police state and the party's intolerance of dissent. The NKVD, successor to the Cheka, becomes a central instrument. Under Genrikh Yagoda, then Nikolai Yezhov, the security apparatus conducts mass arrests, forced confessions, and executions. The show trials in Moscow 1936, 1937, 1938 publicly destroy the old Bolshevik elite. Zinoviev and Kamenev are tried in August 1936 and executed. Bukharin and Rykov are tried in March 1938 and executed. These trials are not genuine legal proceedings. They are political theater designed to rewrite history and to teach the population that no revolutionary pedigree protects anyone. The numbers reveal the scale. During the height of the terror, especially 1937–1938, hundreds of thousands are executed and millions pass through camps and prisons. Soviet archival data released after 1991 indicates that in 1937–1938 alone, the NKVD arrested roughly 1.5 million people and executed around 680,000, though precise figures vary by source and categorization. The terror hits the military as well. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky and other senior officers are arrested and executed in 1937, crippling the Red Army's command structure on the eve of the Second World War. It hits national minorities through national operations, targeting Poles, Germans, Koreans, and others as potential spies. It hits engineers, managers, and ordinary citizens, often through quotas and denunciations. Why does this matter for the story of Stalin rising to power? Because it is the final stage of his ascent, not merely defeating rivals, but making rivalry structurally impossible. After the purges, the party and state are filled with people whose positions depend entirely on Stalin's favor and whose survival depends on obedience. The terror also changes how decisions are made. Officials learn to anticipate Stalin's line, to overfulfill, to avoid risk, to denounce others before being denounced. The system becomes self-policing, with Stalin as the apex. This is not just personal dictatorship, it is a political ecosystem engineered around fear. International events now collide with Stalin's internal empire. The 1930s are a decade of rising fascism and failed collective security. The Soviet Union joins the League of Nations in 1934 and seeks alliances against Nazi Germany, but mutual distrust with Britain and France remains deep. Stalin's foreign policy is shaped by paranoia and pragmatism. When negotiations with Western powers falter in 1939, Stalin makes one of the most consequential decisions of his career, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on 23 August 1939 by Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. The pact includes secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. For Stalin, it buys time. For Europe, it is a death sentence for Poland. Germany invades Poland on 1 September 1939. The Soviet Union invades from the east on 17 September. The Baltic states are coerced into accepting Soviet bases and are annexed in 1940. The Winter War against Finland begins in November 1939 and exposes Soviet military weaknesses made worse by the purges, though the USSR eventually forces territorial concessions in March 1940. In these moves, Stalin is not improvising. He is executing a strategic plan to push borders westward and create buffers. The human cost is immense: deportations, political repression, the destruction of independent states. Stalin's power now shapes the map of Eastern Europe. Then comes Operation Barbarossa. On 22 June 1941, Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union, shattering the pact. The invasion is massive, and early Soviet losses are catastrophic. Stalin's miscalculations, his distrust of intelligence warnings, his belief that Hitler would not risk a two-front war yet contribute to the shock. The Red Army reels. Millions of Soviet soldiers are captured in 1941. Cities are encircled. Leningrad is besieged from September 1941 to January 1944, a blockade that kills over 1 million civilians through starvation and bombardment. The Soviet state faces annihilation. And yet the system Stalin built, centralized, coercive, capable of mobilizing, also becomes the instrument of survival. Industry is evacuated eastward beyond the Urals, production is reorganized, the population is mobilized for total war. The NKVD enforces discipline. Order number 227, issued on 28 July 1942, declares not one step back, establishing blocking detachments and penal units. The war becomes a crucible that both legitimizes Stalin and deepens the state's reach. Victory at Stalingrad in 1940, 219-3, the turning point battle fought in the city that bears his name, becomes a symbol of Soviet resilience and of Stalin's leadership cult. The Red Army pushes west, and by May 1945, Berlin falls. The USSR emerges as a superpower, but at staggering cost. Roughly 27 million Soviet citizens dead, military and civilian. The post-war settlement cements Stalin's geopolitical triumph. Eastern Europe falls under Soviet influence, enforced by the presence of the Red Army and the creation of communist regimes aligned with Moscow. Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, each is reshaped through political pressure, purges, and security services modeled in part on Soviet structures. The Cold War begins not as a single declaration, but as a tightening spiral of suspicion, ideology, and power blocks. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine signals U.S. commitment to containment. In 1948, 1949, the Berlin blockade tests wills. In 1949, NATO forms. Stalin's USSR detonates its first atomic bomb in August 1949, ending the U.S. monopoly and raising the stakes of global rivalry. Inside the USSR, Stalin's late rule combines reconstruction with renewed repression. Wartime openness recedes, campaigns against cosmopolitanism and perceived Western influence intensify. The Leningrad Affair of 1949-1950 targets party officials in Leningrad, leading to arrests and executions, reflecting Stalin's continued fear of alternative power centers. Doctors Plot in 1952-1953, alleging a conspiracy of mostly Jewish doctors to poison Soviet leaders, fuels anti-Semitic hysteria, and suggests another impending purge, though Stalin dies before it can fully unfold. He dies on 5 March 1953. Even his death is enveloped in the system he created, a leadership terrified to act without his approval, a security apparatus woven into governance, a society trained to read signals from above. So how did Stalin really rise to power? Not by being the loudest revolutionary, not by being the purest Marxist, and not by a single decisive betrayal. He rose because the Bolshevik Revolution created a state where the party's internal rules could override law, where emergency measures became permanent, and where control of appointments and information mattered more than public popularity. He rose because he mastered the bureaucracy of a one-party state, using the general secretaryship to build a lattice of loyal officials across the USSR. He rose because his rivals underestimated the power of administration and overestimated the security of their revolutionary reputations. He rose because crises, economic breakdown, grain shortages, international isolation, war allowed him to frame coercion as necessity and dissent as sabotage. And he rose because the institutions of repression, born in civil war and refined through the 1920s, could be turned inward until the party itself was purged of independent authority. The long-term consequences are not confined to Stalin's lifetime. The Soviet Union that emerges from his rule is a paradox, an industrial and military superpower forged through forced mobilization and a society scarred by famine, terror, and distrust. The command economy, accelerated by the 5-year plans, helps defeat Nazi Germany and build strategic parity, but it also locks in inefficiencies and incentives that will haunt Soviet development for decades. The political culture of fear and secrecy undermines innovation and honest reporting, contributing to disasters and stagnation later. The post-war Soviet sphere in Eastern Europe, created through Stalin's security logic, becomes a central front of the Cold War, shaping borders, alliances, and rebellions from Berlin in 1953 to Hungary in 1956 and beyond. Even after Nikita Khrushchev denounces Stalin's cult of personality, in 1956, the underlying architecture, party supremacy, security services, centralized control remains because it was not just Stalin's personality that built it. It was a system designed to concentrate power, and Stalin was the man who learned how to make that concentration irreversible. The takeaway, a century after his ascent began in the shadows of the underground, is that Stalin's rise is a warning about how revolutions harden into regimes. When a political movement defines itself as the sole carrier of historical truth, when it treats opposition as existential, when it centralizes appointments and punishes factionalism in the name of unity, it creates the conditions for one operator to turn procedure into domination. Stalin did not simply seize power, he grew into it, feeding on the institutions and crises of his time until the state could no longer imagine itself without him. And the modern consequences, borders drawn in fear, societies shaped by surveillance, and a geopolitical landscape still haunted by Soviet collapse and memory wars show that the methods used to build power do not vanish when the ruler dies. They linger in institutions, in habits, and in the stories nations tell themselves about how authority is earned and what it is allowed to do.